This is Criteria.
Welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras. I'm here with my co-host, James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hello, Thomas.
And we're excited about today's guest because it's one of the few people we found who is in our precise niche with this podcast. We've been going through the Vatican film list since we started, almost 3 years ago now.
Has it been that long?
Yeah, May 2020, man.
My goodness.
Yeah.
How long is this list?
We're almost done. We are on our fifth to last movie today. We're talking about The Leopard, which was included in the Vatican film list under the category of art.
Dude, when you say it, it just sounds like leper.
Yeah, The Leopard. Il gatto pardo is the Italian name for that animal. This, I think, which means like the spotted cat or something. So anyway, we're talking about The Leopard, and our guest today is one of the co-authors of an upcoming book on the Vatican film list. A topic that nobody has written a book about before, so that's really cool. It's going to be published at the end of this year by Word on Fire, and co-authors are David Paul Baird, Father Michael Ward, and Andrew Petiprin. And today we have David Paul Baird on to talk about The Leopard. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much, guys.
We were looking for people to discuss a number of the few options we have left on the list for us, and our friend Nathan, who's often a co-host on this show, recommended you and said you'd be interested in talking about The Leopard. So what made you want to discuss this film?
Simply put, I think it's a beautiful movie, and it's one of the films on the list that it falls under the art category, and it just offers a sumptuous immersion in a kind of old aristocratic kind of way of being a human, which I think is just offers a really cool little glimpse into another world.
So this film came out in 1963. It was directed by Luchino Visconti, who got his start in the neorealist movement, which we've discussed quite a bit at this point on the podcast. But this film is, I think, well past his, real neorealist period. It certainly doesn't appear to be a neorealist film in its subject matter, in particular. And the film is about Sicilian nobility during the Risorgimento period, which is the period in which Italy was being unified as one nation. And this obviously involved a lot of political, social, and religious upheaval at the time, and had some negative aspects for the church for sure. But this film is not so much about the church's particular relationship with this movement, although it's certainly a part of it. It's really focused on this prince, this Sicilian prince, Don Fabrizio, the Prince of Salina, and the film is based on a novel by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, who was the last prince of Lampedusa, and he wrote the story based on his great-grandfather. So we have an actual nobleman writing this book, and the director of the film is also a descendant of Milanese nobility, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot of interesting personal aspects to this film.
Siete bellissima, come al solito.
Grazie.
È la verità, permettimi.
Caro Fabrizio, lo trovo benissimo.
Grazie, non c'è male.
A noi, Fabrizio.
Sai che pensavo, Alberto? La frequenza di questi matrimoni tra cugini non favorisce la bellezza della razza. Eccole là. Sembrano scimmiette pronte ad arrampicarsi in cima ai lampadari. E da lì, sospese per le code, dondolarsi esibendo i deretani.
And it's also interesting because, Visconti was himself a communist, and yet I think that he manages to write about this nobility with real sympathy, to make a film about this nobility with real sympathy. I don't know, I haven't read the book. Have you?
No.
Have you read the book, David?
I've read chunks of it.
Okay. Do you have a sense of like how much is changed? I mean in the spirit and the sort of the intent of it, not specific plot details.
I think there are some differences. I don't know. We might get into those details later on, but as a whole, I think there's good overlap between the film and the parts of the novel I've read.
Great. Yeah. And it's the novel I think came out in the 50s. I forget what year, but it's not long before this film was made. It was published after the death of the author, I think. But very, very well-respected novel and pretty well known.
I think
even in the US.
I don't know if it's the best-selling Italian novel of all time, but it's up there on the list.
Wow. Wow.
It's interesting because we recently discussed Tree of Wooden Clogs, which, I mean, I don't know my Italian history or geography or like anything really for that matter about Italy. But are these historical periods in the two films like somewhat contemporaneous?
Well, when exactly was the Risorgimento?
I think that was mid-19th century.
So Tree of Wooden Clogs might have been a couple decades later.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
But it is interesting because thematically there is some overlap between the two films.
Sure.
Although they're coming from sort of these radically divergent perspectives, there is still this like reckoning with the onset of the modern age, and a class structure or a way of living a society that's really being relegated to history. So I think that I'm glad that we're discussing these two films in such proximity to each other. Not that I necessarily want to do like a compare and contrast, but it is interesting to think about how, putting these different Vatican film list films in conversation with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. And this film obviously not only is from the perspective of a different group of people, but also aesthetically completely different in its approach from Tree of Wooden Clogs. This is a historical epic, a period film, lavish production. And the reason that the star of the film, I should say, is Burt Lancaster, obviously not an Italian actor, but they brought him in. From my understanding, they needed an American star in order to be able to make such an expensive movie. And I think the studio was still swamped by making this thing.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Burt Lancaster is like the standout aspect of this film for me.
Yeah.
And I think in a way he kind of makes the film. I don't know that you really have this film without an actor of his caliber, but also of his stature. I also mean that physically. Yeah. So there's he really does strike a very striking contrast with the other Italian actors that are around him. He has this like lighter hair, and he's taller, and he's like piercing blue eyes. And so there's like this, and of course like as an actor, he's just got this like gravitas already,
right?
And so that really gels well with the kind of character that he's representing, this leopard, this lion of a bygone age,
Yeah. Now, it's worth pointing out, though, that the film is in Italian and another actor's voice is dubbed into Burt Lancaster's mouth. And the film's original American release was much cut because this film's just over 3 hours. And not only that, but they used his voice. Like they dubbed it all into English.
Oh.
And I saw some clips from that version. That version was not well received, and I saw some clips from it, heard some clips from it, more to the point, heard them. And of course, he's a great actor, but his voice and his accent in particular just doesn't really work. He has a kind of a distinctive accent that doesn't fit.
Sure.
And so it's not that the sound of his voice so much of it as his accent. I think it doesn't really fit. So it actually works great and feels much more natural with this Italian actor dubbed in. I don't even remember the guy's name, unfortunately, off the top of my head, but it fits very seamlessly. And it's an incredible performance. He really handles himself as a noble person, and with great dignity amidst all of these circumstances, which are an indignity to him. And that despite the fact that in the movie pretty early on, you see this is at least from a Catholic perspective, a morally, compromised guy, that you get the sense that like maybe this is like part of the reason why this old order is collapsing is because these people were not like, living godly lives. But I think as the film goes on, you sort of like whatever respect for him you may have lost in some early scenes is like almost regained in a way, or at least you're able to see like the value of this code and this set of values and this bearing that this guy has by the end of the film.
Yeah, somehow his moral failings don't really like strike a moral register in the film. It's just like, I don't know if you agree, but it's just like a datum, and then they move on to what they're really interested in.
Yeah. I think that probably part of what does that is that he's with a priest basically like beginning, like almost during and afterward, because they ride into town. He goes to visit, like a red light district, but he rides into town with the priest at their estate, right. And tells them like, yeah, you can go like spend some time with your Jesuits. And it's almost as if, well, the priest does know what's going on, yeah. And then really kind of confronts him about it the next day, saying you really ought to go to confession.
Right.
And because things are dealt with so candidly, frankly, because he doesn't really deny the wrongdoing, he does say that he's not going to go to confession right away. It's not Saturday.
You don't see a lot of inner conflict in this.
Yeah. So I think that contributes to what you're describing, David. This sort of like it's like offered as like a data point, and then we move on. But I do think that it creates a really interesting tension early on.
Yeah.
When this other beautiful young woman enters the picture.
Totally. I really thought the movie was going to be about conflict between him and his nephew over this beautiful young woman.
And I think that it is in a way, but just not in the way that you expect it to be. It doesn't end up with him, competing with his nephew and then stealing the girl who's like significantly younger than him and like running off with her or something like that. Right. That's not what happens. Yeah. But it is almost as if you are like this scene at the beginning in the red light district. It's almost as if it's a red herring to begin getting you thinking like that this could be a possibility. It's not a possibility,
And also, immediately after that is, before we even get the confrontation with the priest, that's when his nephew is introduced. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but he's shaving in the mirror, and then his nephew's face appears in the mirror, like as though it were his face.
Yeah.
And then they're sort of talking about
They're talking about this very thing that happened with him visiting a prostitute.
Yeah.
And again, there's no like, it's not like I'm holding this against you or I'm going to blackmail you with it. Or it's kind of like a frank avowal. Like, yeah, okay, this is the way it is.
And it's funny because the film begins with, their palace or whatever you want to call it in Sicily, and they're all praying the rosary together. The film is filled with shots of this whole family, like this whole clan, which I really enjoy. Like even characters who never like say a word in the film, there's a number of points where it shows them all arranged in church or sleeping in an inn or whatever, and that's something about that is appealing to me. And to sort of show like this full like sphere of this social, this social class, and also of the prince's responsibilities. So it begins, they're saying the rosary all together, and there's noise outside, and there's disruptions happening, and then he gets a letter from his friend, and the friend is warning about, sort of revolutionary goings on, and everybody's freaking out. His wife is crying. Some people are praying, and he just sort of sits down on the couch with one of his younger daughters, and he's just being very quiet. And then suddenly he just like gets up and like storms out, and he's like, "Get the coach ready. We're going to Palermo." And you think, oh yeah, he's gonna do something. He's been like stewing and like figuring out what to do, and now he's gonna take action. And then he goes to his like mistress's house, and it's like a total like anticlimax. It's quite a surprise, because you don't know what kind of guy this is gonna be at first.
Yeah, it's an interesting framing, because like, to talk about red herrings, like the film begins with these prayers being heard, and so you kind of think like, oh, is this going to be? I know what kind of movie this is going to be on the on the Vatican film list,
Right.
Religion certainly is a feature of the plot.
I mean, it definitely bookends the film,
right? But I don't know, like, it's not really. It's not a theme that's like present except for at those bookends, really. It seems to me,
because most of the time the priest is kind of a figure of fun,
sure, but also really an expression of the social order,
right? He's not a figure of fun like qua priest so much as like qua the very particular relationship that this priest has with his his patron, and sort of the deference to which the sort of absurd levels of deference that he has to show him.
Yeah, I think the priest plays an interesting role in the film, in that I think he is a figure of fun, like you say, but not in like a jester, bells ringing from his hat kind of way. He's also would seem to be a bit of a compromised figure himself, because he does like kind of weakly challenge the prince, but when the prince pushes back, he just kind of shuts up, right? Because I don't know, you can, it's like he knows which side of his bread is buttered on, and he wants to be part of this kind of,
but he doesn't totally shut up. He moderates his tone, he and then after the prince says something sort of like, I don't know what you'd call it, prideful or blasphemous, he then corrects him again. He says, you now have 2 sins to confess. So he's not like totally selling out, but he is like, he's aware of his place.
Yeah.
And you can tell that he appreciates the finer things as well, right? Like there's that scene when they're in the prince's office, and the priest is very much admiring the prince's like telescopes and astronomical equipment.
Yeah, the prince is, it's not like a very emphasized point, but the prince is a stargazer. And, somebody commented on the astronomical meaning of the word revolution, is very at work in this film, because very early on, in fact, in this very scene, when they're in the observatory room with all the telescopes, is the scene where he tells the priest his thoughts on the social upheaval and how it's actually things are going to change and yet stay the same and come back to the same point. It's just it's not that the upper classes are going to be destroyed so much as they're being replaced gently by the middle class.
Right.
So that's like some pretty strong subtext with the astronomical meaning of revolution versus like the normal political usage of that word.
Yeah, and I think the point is the stars theme is relatively understated in the film. It comes back up there in that final scene, but I think it does tap into one of the main motifs of the film, which is just asking this question of what actually does stay the same as like so much around us changes. I think one of the reasons that the ancients were fascinated by the stars is because they seem to represent a kind of fixed point, something that didn't change. Whereas, the planets were the wanderers, the moving points in the sky. So maybe one of the reasons that the Prince of Selena here in this film is fascinated with the stars is because they represent something that won't change despite all that's changing around him.
Yeah, and I think that that one of the impression that you get from this guy is that he's very well acquainted with changing tides, you know, and like how to stay ahead of them, because he handles the revolution handily, you know. He situates his nephew quite expertly to, you know, have like a pretty straight shot, you know, up into these positions of prestige and wealth.
Yeah.
And it's like he's not thrown at all by what's happening. In fact, it's like he reads it more clearly than anybody else does. And so you can't imagine that this is like a newfound aptitude. You know, he must have been reared this way. Perhaps there's something about this nobility that, like, maybe there is like a kind of ancestral wisdom that comes from these sort of like ossified class structures where you're able to begin to see the things that persist versus the things that change. You know, it's easy for the common rabble to get caught up in the flashy slogans and the new tricolors. But maybe an old family that's been around, that's seen it, you know, knows what stays the same.
It's a good question,
you know?
like how much of it is sort of baked into the aristocratic perspective and how much is kind of just him as a far-sighted individual. I'm not sure because like in the ballroom, you know, the extended magnificent ballroom scene that's like the last hour of this film. I don't know if I get the impression that everybody in that room is kind of aware of the changing tides like the prince is. They're just kind of, it's like business revelry as usual, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know what this film was about going into it. I often like to go into movies just in the blind so that I can kind of just receive things as the filmmaker doles them out, you know, and at the pace that he sets. And so those last 45 minutes of the film, that whole ballroom sequence really just like made the film for me. It transformed my reading of the film. It really rescued my overall enjoyment. I had been enjoying it somewhat up until that point, but not being really familiar with Italian history, I was a little like unsure of what was going on. I didn't quite know what to make of this character, and then that last sequence, man, whew. But before diving into there, I did want to say that what my reading ended up being was that this was kind of it can be seen almost as a kind of allegory about the ascendant liberalism over the old world way of thinking and being. And its ultimate kind of emptiness, like the promise of all of these new things of democracy and freedom and like a new dawn for man, but really it's just the same kind of power struggles, the same kind of elite maneuverings, but worse. You know, that key line in the film where the film derives its name is when Don Fabrizio is saying we were the lions, the leopards, and we'll be replaced by the hyenas and jackals. But all of us, lions, hyenas, jackals, and sheep, are going to continue thinking we're the salt of the earth or something. It's an odd thing that doesn't go much further than that, but it struck me as and forgive me for putting it this way, but it struck me as incredibly based. You know what I mean? Do you know what I mean though? Like it seems to me like this was a criticism of liberalism, you know, of being a kind of empty promise. No?
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard for me to evaluate that without knowing more about Italy, you know.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, it's
But if you look at, sorry, go ahead,
I was just going
please.
to comment on the liberalism point. I think that sounds right. Like that's sounds like a fitting read of the film. I wonder if there's like a deeper layer as well that kind of I don't know, taps into the same motifs, which is not so much like political order, although that's a prominent theme in the film, but almost something like worldly glory itself. And that there's this kind of like sic transit gloria mundi feel where like
Yes.
I think it works on those a bunch of different levels.
But I was going to say one of the is like what's one of the things that's like lost in the kind of aristocratic order to the more liberal democratic order is a kind of concentration of wealth and worldly glory. So it's like the same in a sense, ephemerality, earthliness, and or like worldliness in the negative sense, but just like not as glorious somehow.
Yeah. Well, the priest says something interesting about, as a kind of a rejoinder to Fabrizio's saying, yeah, nothing much will change. And he says, well, no, like the I forget how he puts it exactly, but the lower classes are gonna demand something from you, and they're going to be given a portion of your lands to placate them, basically, and then it'll be another portion and another portion until there'll be nothing left, and that seems kind of an appropriate prognosis as well, you know?
Yeah, and this is in the context of him saying that the church's ability to serve the poor will be diminished because the church's, land and the patrimony of the poor is going to be taken away.
Right.
By the nobles making agreements with the liberals and even the Masons, he says, in order to preserve themselves.
Right. Right.
There's a very interesting line right after that by Don Fabrizio, which is like, it's great because it's like only it's like an error that only a Catholic could make.
What does he say?
So he says something like, the church knows it'll be around for eternity, and so it can see things and act accordingly. But the nobility, we know that we don't have that promise to us, and so gaining another 100 years seems like an eternity to us.
Right.
And he claims that you do the same thing if you were in my position, that, and rightly so, if you could if you could sell us out to save yourselves. And that's when the priest says you have another sin to confess. But yeah, just that idea that like Fabrizio, it's not that he's like not a believing Catholic. It's just that he's not being a sinner. Just like, it feels like it meant something so different back in those like thoroughly Catholic societies, because it wasn't even that you were like leaving the church necessarily or saying I'm not Catholic anymore. It was just like, you still believe it on some level, but you're just not living it. But there's this tension there that doesn't exist when you can just sort of like be like, I'm leaving the church and this is all like nonsense. I don't know. It's just a very interesting line for that reason, but also the idea that even the nobility is ultimately selling out. Like it ultimately is like maybe doing the same thing that the lower classes and the middle classes are doing,
right?
In a sense,
yeah. Like, and this film does not paint like a. It is dealing in nostalgia to some extent, but it doesn't paint like a picturesque picture of the nobility, of the aristocracy. It's not like what's the like for the South, what's that term? I don't know why I'm not remembering. The great not the Great Lie, but like
the Lost Cause.
Yeah, like it's not like a kind of lost cause mythology that it's painting here. Mm-hmm. But I also think that it would be a mistake to look at this film as being like only a critique of the aristocracy and kind of a championing of this new world order that's emerging.
Yeah, well, I mean, what comes off much worse is the nephew.
Exactly. Who represents this kind
who's
of
wheeling and dealing, and he's switching sides all the time, and kind of mercenary in that sense. And the uncle it's not that he doesn't make compromises, but he does sort of have a sense of loyalty, like when he refuses to join the Senate. You know, he's like, I'm stuck between these two worlds, and I'm not totally comfortable in either, and I have a tie of decency to the old order, if not of affection. And so there's a certain kind of integrity there that you can respect that seems to be absent in other people. And it's also very interesting because, like, part of the discomfort for him is like being put into close association with like sort of the middle class, I guess, like particularly in the form of I'm forgetting the guy's name, but basically his nephew's prospective father,
Angelica's dad,
right? Who
He's like
is
the chief citizen.
Angelica's dad.
What was that? Yeah, Angelica's dad. Yeah. And so this guy is kind of a boor. He's classless. He thinks of everything in terms of money. And when he's at the big party at the end, he keeps talking about how much the chandeliers would cost and that sort of thing. And this is clearly like just this guy just doesn't get it, you know?
Right.
But then you also see that he is Fabrizio is friends with Ciccio, who is the church organist, and he's a poor man, and they go out shooting together, and he's sort of like his hunting assistant.
Right.
But they talk, and Ciccio, within limits, can express his opinion about things freely,
right,
and feels that freedom, you know, and even maybe goes too far at times in expressing himself. But one of the big thing that Ciccio says is about his sense of loyalty, and the reason why he wouldn't vote yes because they have a plebiscite for the unification of Italy, which is clearly rigged. That's another interesting point about this democracy and, you know, the movement for the people and stuff. It's actually not reflecting what everybody's votes are. But Ciccio explains the reason he voted no is because of his loyalty to the old queen who helped his family and who paid for before she was the queen, paid for his musical education to become an organist for the church. And so we also get a sense of lower class people who are also in on this old order, and they do have a sense of the long term,
right?
And this is talked about in good and bad ways, because, you know, when the guy is there trying to get Don Fabrizio to become a senator, Fabrizio goes on this long monologue about the sort of the character of Sicily and the Sicilian people and how they're not really willing to change. They think they're fine how they are. And he's not just talking about the nobility, he's talking about everybody. And I can't pretend to understand all of the things that he's talking about there, but it's fascinating, you know, this Sicilian character that he's talking about. I don't know that I fully understand what he's saying because I don't know that much about Sicily, but so there is this sense that it's not just about the nobility, it's the whole order, it's the whole hierarchy and the whole way of seeing things, which includes, I mean, hierarchy is not exclusive by definition, it's inclusive, right? And so you know, the peasants and the lower class people are included in this, and they have a sense of self from it in good and bad ways.
Right.
Going back to your point about how I think it'd be a mistake to read it either as like full-on nostalgia for the old or a full-on endorsement of the new. I think that sense of a kind of bittersweet longing, but also some kind of, almost like excited anticipation for what's coming next, like a freshness that's being introduced. I think that combined sense is captured magnificently in this final dance, or this dance between the prince and Angelica.
Yeah.
It's kind of
totally
like his last waltz and her first waltz, like the representative of the old, like bowing out, and the representative of the new coming in, and how great they look together, really.
Yeah. And really, I think that you can see this, what we're talking about, in the character of Fabrizio himself, because even as he is a part of this old order, he is moving out of the way and getting ready for a new one. And so he without any sense of like, bitterness or ill will, he really does work quite hard to set up his nephew for success in this world to come. And there is sometimes some tension there, maybe even some jealousy. One of the themes in here is just realizing when one has become old, and thinking about death. And we haven't spoken a lot about this nephew, but they really are kind of presented as almost being the same person. Like you can almost look at them as this is the older version and this is the younger version. You can, in looking at the nephew, what's his name? I forget. Yeah, begins with a T,
Tancredi?
but
Yeah. I'm not good at this.
Tancredi. Tancredi, yeah. In looking at him, it's like you can almost imagine what young Fabrizio may have been like, and the kinds of situations he would have been in, and the ways that he learned, to be how he is, and so I think that they really are presented as almost being. I mean, they're very closely identified with each other, and yet there are some stark differences. And but going back to what I was saying is that even in the character of Fabrizio himself is this kind of ambivalence, this like sort of dual, like simultaneous wanting to hold on, but also beginning to let go.
It's fascinating too that the prince, you can tell. I mean, he's thoroughly a part of his aristocratic world, and yet he has enough circumspection to be able to critique it and see the ugly side as well. So like they're at the ball, and and he's looking at is that like the funniest line in the film maybe, when he sees all the princesses hopping around on this like XXX king-sized bed. And he describes them. What does he say? These frequent marriages between cousins don't do much to improve the stock. and he says they look like monkeys trying to clamber up the chandeliers.
Yeah.
So he's like, you can see the kind of decadence and the ugly side of his whole order as well. So in a way, like he isn't sorry to see it go, even though like he doesn't want to see it go, and he realized that means like he's going as well. It's just interesting both and, where it's like he's kind of preparing for a graceful death, or trying to.
Yes. And anybody who hasn't seen this film and is listening to us talk about this could be forgiven in thinking that maybe this is a very like dry, political, kind of cerebral story, but actually it's not. Actually it's very human, it's very personal, because all of this stuff that we're talking about, all these class dynamics and social subtleties are playing out in the context of what is a very human story that comes to a head in this last 45 minutes, and really the last like 25 minutes. I think the timestamp, it's almost like exactly at the 25-minute mark when the final waltz begins. And that whole ballroom sequence, I said this already, really made the film for me, because up until that point, if it had been this kind of this story, granted about a single man, but still really about Italy and all these societal changes that are going on and the political maneuverings that are happening within that. And then maybe every once in a while, a little bit of flash of humanity with like a monologue about the Sicilian death wish or something. In this final sequence, it was like, it was almost as if it became a completely different film to me. And all of a sudden I was just seeing everything differently. Like, even the way that it's shot, there's just like gorgeous cinematography in this final 45 minutes where Fabrizio is like wandering in this wasteland of this just extravagant ball with beautiful costumes and amazing, set pieces, it really drives home how beautiful a movie this is, and as a historical epic. But he's in that almost as like the who's that German painter who's always painting like the like small people in nature, like the thinker with the water. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Caspar David Friedrich, maybe.
Yes. It's almost like the inverse of that, where like he's in this torrent of like social extravagance, but he's like this lone sojourner. There's so many cool shots like that. One of my favorites is right at the very end when he's getting ready to leave, and everybody's getting ready to leave. They're all putting on their coats or whatever, and the camera's like slowly panning in, and he's just slowly putting on his coat. He's in profile, and he's like so deep in thought. And of course, this is at the end of this sequence, but throughout all of it, he's spending time with this painting of a man at his deathbed. He's looking at himself in the mirror, and tears are coming to his eyes. He's like you mentioned, David, looking around at these silly people, these like deeply unserious people, whether it's the young debutantes or these older generals or the nouveau riche, and it's like it's just such an incredibly human and introspective and dramatic climax to this story that really transforms and colors everything that came before, and especially in this relationship between him and his nephew, where Angelica asks him for a dance, and you can see that the nephew is like he's actually sweating, there's like there's a sense that all he would it's almost as if all that Fabrizio would need to do is reach out and take it, and he could, but he doesn't. He goes out and he just gives this like amazing dance. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, and it's like this. It's when, if there had been any sort of sexual tension or any sort of questioning this guy's character, like, oh, is there gonna be like this affair? Is he gonna like cut ties with his nephew? Like, it doesn't happen. He has this like sort of graceful bowing out, and then it's like Galadriel, like diminishing into the west. Do you know what I mean? It's so exciting and so tragic. It's all capped off with this amazing final scene of him walking home by himself, and as he's heading in one direction, a little boy ringing a bell, preceding a priest carrying the Blessed Sacrament to one of the homes
for last rites for someone.
Yeah, comes by walking in the other direction.
I hadn't seen it so clearly until listening to you just now, but I think the story really is a story of redemption in a way, because as we talked about earlier, it starts off with Fabrizio doing exactly the opposite, which is reaching out and taking what he wants, regardless of the moral consequences, or it's almost this brazen, somehow moral indifference where he's just kind of going through the motions of doing whatever he wants. And then here at the end, I think, like you said, there is that sense of, he could probably get away with doing it one last time if he wanted to. But he takes the road of self-renunciation, and maybe in a sense, like, realizes the promise of his nobility. We often talk about, social nobility, but the kind of moral nobility of stepping back for someone else's good. And he finally does that at the end.
Yeah, I think there really is a sense that he has changed. Something in him has changed, and that it's almost as if it changes from the moment he walks into that ball to the moment he walks out. Like if things are beginning to catalyze before this scene, they really happen during this sequence. And
that's the cool thing about the sequence, is that it gives you so much time with him just like silently watching and reflecting and deep in thought. And feeling his age and looking at this painting of a deathbed scene that's in one of the rooms, and it takes long enough so that it's like plausible that he's like processing all this stuff in this time period. To be honest, I really struggled with this sequence in my first viewing. I liked all the stuff with Don Fabrizio, but I found I was very bored by just like the dancing parts, because I was like, I think I was interiorly comparing it to like other ballroom dance sequences I had seen in historical films, and I thought that they were shot more in a more visually interesting way, or maybe you're like sort of in the crowd of people, or there's different things happening. These shots were very static in terms of the framing and things like that, and it wasn't. I mean, I don't want to get into it that much, but it's what I'm realizing. I mean, what I was realizing is that I think that's like part of what it gets, how it gets its point across, is like the staticness of it, and the fact that you're not really invested in like any individual group of people among the mass of people dancing around. The camera's not like following people. You can imagine like a modern movie in like a party scene, of the camera's like sort of weaving through the crowd, and and stuff like that, and it's sort of, you're like overwhelmed on that level. But this is more like, it is a bystander, and he probably feels much like I feel when I'm at a dance that I'm not participating in, which is like a little bit like detached and like bored. No, I was really bored in a lot of the dancing parts on my first viewing, less so the second time, because I sort of like understood better what the point was. I think. No,
I found him deeply sympathetic throughout this. Not the least because I also, am like, I like to sort of like hug the wall at a party, and so when he was like, I don't want to be here, but I am, and so I have to stay because it would be rude, I was like, oh yeah, I know that.
Right.
I know that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, even his visual appearance throughout this sequence changes. It's almost like he grows paler or more like deathly as the sequence plays on. I don't know, maybe I'm making that up, but certainly part of what's selling all of this is his performance. Burt Lancaster just knocks it out of the park in this final 45 minutes. There's some really intense moments. And then again, I just want to say, like, the way that it's shot, there are some great moments where like the shadows from above that hit Bert's, really striking features in a way to like, cast like harsh shadows over his eyes, or when he's in that parlor and he lights up a cigar, and there's just, it's almost like film noir. This moment where he's like going into these dark thoughts, and you can see it represented visually. It's very cool. So yeah, like I was mostly enjoying the film up until that point. I think I've already said this, but I was kind of feeling a little nonplussed. And then when that ballroom sequence happened, I was like, oh man, okay, I see why this is a great
Thomas,
film.
I think we might have had different experiences of the first go round in the ball there. For me, I was totally, I don't know how to say it, like absorbed by the sensual extravagance of the depiction. Even just like to my mind, this is a sort of film that it would be really hard to make today, at least in the way that they made it, just because of like the expense of clothing 500 extras in period dress and just having them dance around.
Well, they had actual nobility there. It was a real party that they had, and they had nobility there, like participating and dancing and stuff.
Right. Yeah. Apparently, I mean, they would start sort of dressing at like 2 p.m. in the afternoon and kind of get everything geared up until like night fell. And then they would film all the way until sunrise for several weeks, I think. So it was like, wow. I don't know, it was like a whole month of the party.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
And apparently, yeah.
I think maybe I've seen too many movies maybe I've seen too many movies, and like I just like wasn't sufficiently appreciating like the lavishness of it on my first viewing, because I was like, I don't know, I was just like, man, this cinematography is boring. Like, yeah. I wasn't really getting the point of it, because I think it's supposed to be a little bit detached in the way that it frames. I mean, there's a lot of activity on the screen, but the way that it's framed is like very non-flashy.
Yeah, that's right. There's from another angle there's some great stories from the legendarium of the shoot of the production. So apparently Visconti was, like, as you say, he was an aristocrat himself. He was born in a palace, very much like where this party takes place, and apparently he based what happens at the ball on his own memories of what the parties his parents would throw when he was a kid. So there's that, and apparently he had very refined tastes, to put it that way. There's a story of when they were doing the prep work for the costumes, they would bring Visconti like different cloth samples without price tags to get him to, like, pick, would you want this one, that one? Apparently he'd feel them one by one and without fail pick the most expensive one. There's also a story where all of like the flowers on set apparently are real flowers, even the ones that are like out of focus in the background. And he apparently didn't like the flowers in Sicily, so he had all of those flowers imported from somewhere else in Italy. Yeah. Oh. So it's like part of the reason maybe this film bankrupted its production company is just the crazy lavish expenditure that was going into these shots.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I wanted to make sure that at some point in this episode we spent some time talking about this forthcoming work that you're contributing to on the Vatican Film List. Are you writing anything about the Leopard in this?
Sure.
book?
Yeah. Every chapter in the book is dedicated to one of these films. So the Leopard gets a designated chapter. Yeah. So the book, should say something about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
The working title, I don't think you mentioned it before, Thomas, and it could change, listeners, but the working title is Popcorn with the Pope, a guide to the Vatican Film List. And yeah, the point of it is to offer a kind of ramp up, if you like, into some of these films, many of which, as Tom, you guys will know, are old or obscure or foreign language. It's not like the typical Blockbuster or Netflix offering that we're used to. So a lot of us. So part of the point of the book is just to kind of like help get from A to B. Like, how can I appreciate these films that were recommended, 25 odd years ago.
And are all three of you working on every single chapter, or are you splitting up the list and some people are hitting some films and others are hitting others?
So the main thing is we divided it up, and but then we've gone back through and offered our comments and so on for the others. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So did you score the Leopard chapter? Or
I especially requested this one. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
And have we like covered a lot of what you've discussed in the book, or are there any fresh takes that we haven't heard yet?
Maybe one small point which we've danced around a bit, no pun intended, and which is that last scene when the prince is standing under the stars, and he offers a kind of prayer in that moment for something, to encounter something that will last, and like a few beats later is when we hear the bell and the consecrated host is walked by. And I think even just at a rhetorical level, that's fascinating, because on the one hand he's appealing to heaven and the stars, these heavenly bodies, and then what he gets is, if you like, the terrestrially heavenly body of the consecrated host, like, processed past him. So he has a kind of intuition, almost like the Magi, maybe, like following the stars, and then like eventually it's like finally, and almost like in quite a quiet moment on this quiet street outside in contrast to the riotous ball that's been going on, he has this encounter with the kind of maybe like true referent of his longing.
Yeah, I saw that ending sequence, and it's like it takes your breath away. This final scene, and my reading of it, and again, I think that it's like a very rich symbolic sequence, so you could take it in any number of ways, but it's pretty clear that as he takes this darker road off out of the frame, he's receding into the past, like he's fading into history to be never seen again.
Right.
But meanwhile, Jesus in the Eucharist has gone in the other direction, the opposite direction, also going out of the frame, but passing through a doorway, like a lit doorway into a home. And to me, it's like Jesus is present and goes past the into the future,
Wow.
And so
That's great.
yeah, so it's like I said, like religion doesn't seem to play like a very strong theme throughout the film. It's not, in my reading, it's not really dealing with that first and foremost, but it's there from the beginning and then at the end. And another another literary work that I thought of as I was watching this was Brideshead Revisited. A much more, I think, a much more, like, religion saturates that story much more thoroughly than it does here, but some similar concerns, and a similar way of Jesus kind of and grace kind of sneaking up on you.
Am I the only person who got major mafia vibes?
Totally.
From this movie.
Totally.
It's like these are the ancestors of the mafia. They're
Yeah.
just like particular moments. Not just that they're calling someone Don, not that, but just we're a nation of arrangements or something.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Totally.
Just all the sort of like wheeling and dealing and the way people are introduced, and yeah, very, very interesting. And I really thought he was going to keel over in his chair in that ballroom sequence. I thought it was going to be a Godfather death scene where he like falls over in his chair.
Yeah. Well, I think this would make an excellent double feature with The Godfather.
Yeah.
I think that this would be a really cool movie to watch.
Well, I mean, The Godfather has some similar themes too,
Totally. Absolutely. Absolutely.
But so it's pretty cool how much of a sense of death the last hour of this film gives, like, without him actually dying in the movie, because my roommate watched the film with me and he had read the book some time ago, and he said that in the book he does die 20 years after this ball. And then there's a whole part where like the church is entering into some dispute with the family over some like relics that are in the family's possession or something, like even after he dies. So there's like more stuff in the book. So it was very well handled, the way that he sort of just goes down that dark alley at the end.
Yeah.
So one little sidelight on the mafia connection. Apparently there was an Italian cardinal at the time who made a public statement about how this movie and the mafia were two of the major contributors to the dishonor of Sicily.
Wow.
Yeah, so wasn't universally received with high praise.
David, thank you for coming on. We're looking forward to getting your book when it comes out.
For sure, yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Maybe we'll see you again once it's available to be on the shelves.
Yeah. So we're gonna be done. We're gonna be doing our wrap up on the list in early summer, and we're going to be my plan is not only to have our discussion, but also to like take a poll of all of the people that we know, not that many people, but everybody we know who have seen all or most of the Vatican film list, and sort of ask them just a few like basic questions about their views. Like, what would you add if it was made today? What would you take off? What was a no-brainer that was already out at the time that they didn't include? That kind of thing. And so that we could sort of not have like 15 guests on our wrap-up episode, but just sort of include some views from other people in the episode. But then since you have this book coming out, also I think it'll be really nice, like it's coming out half a year after we're going to do our wrap-up on the list. It'll be nice to be able to revisit the list and have all of the co-authors back on if possible to revisit the list and sort of get a fresh perspective on it, since this has been like the major project of this podcast so far.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I don't know if you guys are open to it. I could see about getting you all an advanced copy, since you are,
Sure. Yeah,
I don't
that'd
know,
be
Oh my
awesome.
on the
gosh,
inside,
yeah, that'd be great.
inside track
That'd
of
be
all
great.
this.
That'd be great.
Yeah, well, everybody, thank you for listening, and please subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And if you'd like to help us continue all of our podcasts, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Our next episode is going to be with our regular guest co-host, Nathan Douglas, and we're going to be talking about the film Ordette, which is by Dreyer, who also did The Passion of Joan of Arc, which we discussed last year. So we're looking forward to that, and that'll come out they're like right before or right after Ash Wednesday, depending on how quickly I get it edited. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.